Wyoming Territory, July 1882. The wind carried grit and the scent of dry sage when Violet Vexley stepped off the freight wagon and into the dust-choked silence of Broken Hill. Her boots hit the ground like she was deciding to stay. She had nothing left but a faded carpetbag, a heart full of bruises, and two wide-eyed children clinging to her skirt. "Ma," murmured 6-year-old Maybelle, her copper curls tangled from the road. "Is this where we stop?" Violet dropped to one knee, brushing dirt from Maybelle's cheek. "This is where we start." Her son, Micah, only 4, clung tighter to her waist. He had not spoken much since Cheyenne, not since the man who called himself their stepfather had sold their mule for whiskey and left them behind a saloon. She rose slowly, back stiff from too many cold nights. They were alone, but alone was better than what they had come from. A man leaned against the post outside the mercantile, watching. Not with judgment, but with a quiet kind of stillness that Violet had only ever seen in horses who had been broken once and chose carefully what they trusted again. He wore a trail-worn hat low over his brow, his shirt faded and patched, but not dirty. There was a rifle balanced behind his shoulder, and his boots were clean. That told her more than anything. He took care where it counted. "Name's Vaughn Astor," he said quietly, stepping forward when no one else in the street did. "You look like you need a place to breathe." Violet hesitated. Her fingers curled tighter around the children's shoulders. "I am not asking for charity." "Good," he said. "I am not offering any." Her eyes flicked to the sign swinging gently beside the mercantile porch. Above it, a hand-painted notice read, "Room to rent, inquire within." Vaughn nodded once toward it. "My land's 15 miles west. But the owner here is my cousin. I can get you that room for half the posted price." She studied him. "Why?" He shrugged once. "Because I know what it looks like when someone is trying to outrun something." She did not answer, but she did not walk away either. By nightfall, the children were asleep on the straw mattress in the small upstairs room of the mercantile. Violet sat near the window watching the moon rise over the dry plains. Vaughn had not stayed long, just enough to help carry up their bag, fix the shutter hinge, and leave a wrapped parcel of bread and dried apples on the table. She had thanked him. He had tipped his hat and left without a word. She did not know what to make of him yet, but he had looked her in the eye. Most men stopped doing that when they realized she had children and no husband. The next morning, she was sweeping the mercantile porch when she saw him again. He rode in on a roan stallion, reins loose, the way a man rode when he trusted the animal more than the road. "Need work?" he asked without preamble. "I need coin," she answered, straightening up. "Same thing," he said, then nodded toward the wagon behind him. "I need someone who can cook, sew a saddle strap, and keep 2 stubborn dogs from fighting." "I can do all that." He looked at her children who stood beside her, blinking up at him. "I am not leaving them behind," she said. "I was not asking you to." His homestead was rough, but not falling apart. The house was one room with a lean-to kitchen, and the barn had a roof patched with old feed sacks. But the fences were mended and the water well was clean. He lived quiet, with a dog that followed him everywhere and a horse that did not need reins. Violet worked hard. She made bread from what little flour he had, boiled water for the children's baths, patched his shirts without him asking. She did not need thanks. She just needed not to be afraid. He never asked questions, never touched her, but he always made sure the children had what they needed. He taught Micah how to whittle and gave Maybelle a book of prairie flowers. One night, as she took in the last of the wash from the line, she saw him standing by the fence, watching the sunset. She stepped beside him, wrapping the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You are not like the others." He looked at her slowly. "I reckon neither are you." She smiled, just a little. It had been so long since she had smiled without it hurting. Weeks passed. The children stopped jumping at loud noises. They started laughing again. Maybelle braided wildflowers into Violet's hair. Micah learned to feed the chickens. And Vaughn? He stayed near, but not too near. Every day he showed her in quiet ways that he meant to stay. A bucket of fresh-picked berries on the windowsill. A repaired hinge on the barn door. A new pair of boots for Micah. One night, while the children slept beside the hearth, Violet stepped outside to find Vaughn sitting on the porch steps, sharpening his knife in the moonlight. "I never thanked you," she said. "You do not have to," he replied. "Yes, I do." You gave us more than a roof. He looked up at her, eyes dark and steady. You gave me something too. She sat beside him, knees brushing his. What did I give you? He paused, then looked forward again. A reason to come home. She reached for his hand. He let her. His fingers were calloused, but warm. They sat like that for a long time, the Wyoming wind quiet around them. It was nearly autumn when the trouble came. Violet was hanging laundry when she saw the riders. 3 of them. The kind who leaned too far back in the saddle and smiled with their teeth when they talked. Her stomach dropped before they even spoke. Violet Vexley, one of them said, grinning as he dismounted. Well, I will be damned. You really ran all the way out here. She stepped in front of the children. You need to leave. Now that ain't friendly, said the second one, spitting into the dirt. You were mine once, Violet. And you took off with my money and my mule. You lost the mule in a card game, she snapped. The third man stepped forward. We are taking her back. Micah whimpered behind her. Maybelle clutched her skirt. Before she could say another word, a voice came from the tree line. No, you are not. Vaughn stepped out from the shadows, rifle in hand. His eyes were cold now. The kind of cold that came from years alone, from learning how to survive. You got 5 seconds to turn around, he said. The first man laughed. You gonna shoot us, cowboy? If you touch her, yes. The men hesitated. They looked at Violet, then at Vaughn, then at the 2 children behind her. Fine, the tallest muttered. But she belongs back with us. No, Violet said, standing tall. I do not belong to anyone. Not anymore. They rode off in a cloud of dust. Violet turned to Vaughn. Her hands were shaking. He stepped forward and put his arms around her, not asking, just holding. You were safe, he said into her hair. I know, she whispered. Because I found you. He kissed her then. Slow, steady, sure. Like he meant it. Like he had been waiting a long time to. And she kissed him back because she had been waiting too. The wind had changed by morning, blowing low and steady from the west. It carried the scent of dry pine and smoke from a far-off fire, too distant to threaten them but close enough to remind Violet that the world beyond the homestead still turned, still stirred. Maybelle sat cross-legged beneath the cottonwood, stringing together fine horsehair she'd gathered from the brush fence. Micah trailed Vaughn at a respectful distance, matching his stride as they checked the irrigation ditch along the south field. Violet watched from the kitchen lean-to, her hands buried in cool dough, pressing and folding with more strength than she'd ever had in her arms back when her days were filled with silence and caution. The night before had changed something between them. Not in words, but in the way Vaughn lingered beside her now, his presence no longer guarded. When she passed him a tin cup of water earlier, his fingers had held hers a little longer. The look he gave her wasn't study or caution anymore, it was something settled, something sure. By noon, the clouds dragged shadows across the hills and Vaughn returned from the field alone. Micah's with the dogs, he said, wiping his hands on a rag. He's got a good way with them. Violet set aside the bowl. He never liked animals before. Maybe they trust each other. Both been kicked enough. She leaned against the doorframe. He hasn't had a fever since we came here. He sleeps through the night now. Vaughn nodded once, then said nothing. She waited, but he didn't move or look away. So she asked, What made you stay here all these years? He looked off toward the pasture. My brother died in Montana. That winter, I passed through this valley and something about it held me. Built the house from scavenged boards and stayed. I figured if I left again, I'd break apart. You haven't left since? Rode to Laramie once. Didn't care for it. Violet smiled faintly. I think you were waiting. For what? She stepped toward him, voice low. For someone to come in from the wind. He didn't answer, but he reached for her hand, warm and rough and steady. She let him take it. That evening, Vaughn rode to the edge of his claim to check the west fence. Violet stayed behind, stringing beans for drying, while Maybelle read aloud from the old flower guide. Micah dozed with the dogs curled against his legs. The sky was dimming when the sharp report of a rifle cracked the stillness. Violet's hands froze. The dogs jerked awake, ears pricked. She ran from the porch, heart pounding. scanning the horizon. Vaughn rode back at a gallop, rifle still across his lap. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, a line of dark red staining the fabric. He slid from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. 3 men again, he said. They circled wide, tried to come around from the ridge. I winged one. They ran. She pressed a damp cloth to his shoulder. You're bleeding. It's shallow. He hissed once, then grit his teeth. They're not done. They'll come back. Not tonight, but soon. Violet's breath came hard. She looked toward her children, who stood silent on the porch. Then we can't stay. Vaughn's voice was quiet. You're not running again. Not unless I'm riding beside you. She met his eyes. We can't face them alone. We won't have to. At daybreak, he rode out alone, telling her only there's a man down near Powder River. Owes me a favor. 2, if he remembers right. He returned 2 days later with a wagon trailing behind him. A woman sat in the back with a rifle across her lap and a baby tied to her chest. Her husband drove the team, lean, serious, with a scar across his cheek. Elias and Lena, Vaughn said as he dismounted. They've helped before. Violet stepped forward. You told them. I didn't need to. I said your name and Lena was already packing. The couple stayed that night and the next. Lena helped Violet boil water and set up cots for the children in the barn's hayloft, safer if anyone came near. Elias and Vaughn walked the fence line and sharpened blades without needing words. On the 3rd night, the sky bruised to black and the moon rose pale over the hills. Violet sat beside Vaughn on the porch, a lantern between them. The children slept above the horses. The dogs dozed at their feet. I've been thinking, she said. He waited. I thought love would always hurt, that it was something taken from you, carved out of you. But it doesn't feel like that now. No, he said. It shouldn't. She looked at him, hands clasped in her lap. I never said it before. Never let myself. He reached for her hand again. Say it now. I love you, she whispered. Not because you saved me. Because you saw me. He leaned close. I love you. Because you stayed. They kissed again, soft and sure as the stars above them. A promise, not a question. Inside, the lantern burned low and the wind carried no danger, only the dry hush of summer easing into fall. The first frost settled light as breath across the high grass. The mornings came quiet and pale, and each day Violet found herself folding into the rhythm of the land as though she'd always been here, rising before the children woke, drawing water, warming bread on the stove while the wind stirred faintly beneath the eaves. Vaughn built a second coop behind the barn, saying nothing about why, though Violet knew. He did things that way, never speaking of the future, only shaping it with his hands. Elias and Lena rode out the week before, after Vaughn walked the ridge and saw no fresh tracks. The tension that had lived in Violet's chest since the men rode off had eased some, but not completely. She still listened too closely when a coyote howled, still kept a rifle leaned behind the doorframe. That morning, as the sun broke over the ridge, she stepped into the yard with a bucket of feed and paused at the sound of Vaughn's voice beyond the corral. She rounded the fence and found him with a man she didn't recognize, older, thin-faced, coat worn to the thread. His hat was in his hands, and he stood with a kind of bowed respect not common among men who passed through. This is Ira McCall, Vaughn said, glancing toward her. Used to ride with my brother. Violet studied him. You came far. From the Tongue River, Ira said, voice rasped from long wind. Heard what happened. Thought I ought to give warning, seeing as the men who came through weren't just passing. They've been asking about your place at every outpost from Sheridan to the foothills. Vaughn folded his arms slowly. You know their names? I know the oldest one, Rafe Danner. He's run out of 3 counties but keeps slipping through. The other 2, I don't know. But they're riding with him like they've got something to prove. Violet kept still, her voice even. Why warn us? Ira looked at her then, the way men look at graves they never finished mourning. Because your man's brother once pulled me out of a winter drift and fed me from his own stores. I pay my debts. Vaughn nodded once. That's fair. Ira looked back to the trail. I'd say you've got a week if the weather holds. Maybe less if they find horses to trade. When he had gone, Violet followed Vaughn into the barn. The horses stirred, sensing the shift in the air. "You still mean to stay?" she asked him. He didn't look back. "This land's the only thing I've ever made with my own hands. I won't let them take it." She stepped closer. "And us? You're the only thing I've ever wanted to keep." She laid a hand on his back. "Then we make ready." They spent the next days preparing quiet, steady, without panic. Vaughn moved the wagon into position near the barn, reinforced the front wall of the house with stacked firewood and spare planks. Violet packed a separate bag with clothes and food in case she needed to flee with the children. She didn't speak of it to Vaughn, but he noticed all the same. "You think I'll fall," he said one night as they sat beside the hearth. "I think I've learned not to bet on chances," she said softly. "You won't have to run. You can't promise that." He turned to her. "I'll die before I let them take you." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I want to marry you." His brow furrowed. "Now? There might not be a later. And I want to belong to something right before the wrong comes again." He reached for her hand. "You already belong here. But if you want my name, it's yours." They wed at sunrise. No preacher, no papers. Just the wind, the land, and their joined hands. Maybelle braided a crown from dried grass and placed it on Violet's head, solemn as a chapel bell. Micah stood beside Vaughn, holding a small carved token he'd made from driftwood, Vaughn's initials etched into the surface. "I take you," Violet said, voice low but steady, "for all the days we have." "And I take you," Vaughn answered, "for as long as I draw breath." They kissed, and it wasn't just affection, it was home-made real. The third night after their vows, the dogs began to growl low near the barn. Vaughn stepped out with his rifle as Violet eased the children into the root cellar beneath the kitchen. She lit a lantern and left it with them, whispering once to Maybelle, "If I knock 5 times, you open." No sooner. She stepped out into the yard, the cold sharp and dry against her cheeks. Vaughn stood near the fence, rifle raised, his body still as stone. "They're here," he murmured. 3 riders moved through the trees, slow and deliberate. No need to hide, they wanted to be seen. The tallest, Rafe, dismounted and walked forward with his hands wide. "You don't want to do this," Vaughn warned. "I don't want to hurt her," Rafe called back. "I just want what's mine." She was promised. "No," Violet said, stepping forward. "I was pressed, not promised." "You don't speak now, girl," Rafe snapped. Vaughn raised the rifle. "She speaks when she pleases. And you're 3 steps from dying if you move wrong." Rafe's eyes narrowed. "You're a fool, Astor. You think you can hold her forever? Women wander. She'll tire of this place and you'll be nothing but dust in her stories." "I don't need to hold her," Vaughn said. "She stays because she wants to." The other 2 men drew their weapons, but too slow. Vaughn fired once, dropping the man on the right. The dogs rushed the second, teeth flashing. Rafe lunged toward Violet, but she didn't flinch. She pulled the small pistol Vaughn had taught her to use from her coat and shot him through the shoulder. He dropped, howling, the sound torn from him like bark from a tree. "Leave," she said, "or the next one's your heart." He scrambled to his feet, blood pattering the earth, and staggered toward the trees. Vaughn didn't chase. He stood beside her, breathing hard, eyes watching the shadows until they were empty again. When the silence returned, Violet turned to him and said, "We're done running." He nodded. "And they're done hunting." She reached for his hand. "Let's go get our children." They pulled open the cellar door and found Maybelle holding Micah close, the lantern still burning. Violet lifted them both into her arms. Vaughn set a blanket around them and ushered them inside. That night, they didn't speak of fear, or blood, or what might have been. They sat together on the floor before the fire, children between them, warmth shared in silence. Outside, the frost thickened, but the house held strong. And for the first time in years, Violet didn't listen for footsteps in the dark. She listened only to the breath of the man beside her and the even sleep of her children and the steady creak of old timbers that had never known such peace. The snow came early, soft and windless, laying a thin hush over the land that muted the world in white. Vaughn had known the signs, the way the birds vanished from the fence posts, the stillness in the horses before dawn, and he'd brought in the last of the firewood without needing to be asked. Violet stood at the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands moving steadily as she stirred the pot. The cabin smelled of onions and marrow bone, and the children sat at the table, carving shallow lines into scrap pine boards with Vaughn's dullest knife. Maybelle hummed under her breath, a tune Violet didn't recognize, and Micah leaned close to the lantern glow, his head tilted in thought. Vaughn stepped in, boots brushing snow from the threshold. He set down his rifle in the corner and unwound the scarf from his neck, then shook the frost from his sleeves. "You see anything?" Violet asked, not turning from the pot. "Just tracks from a fox. Fence lines holding. No sign of trouble." Micah looked up. "Will the fox come near the chickens?" "Not if your dog keeps barking like he did last night," Vaughn said, pulling off his coat. "He's louder than a freight train." "Train's never been here," Maybelle said, still humming. "Not yet, but I saw one once," Vaughn replied. "Ran through the edge of Nebraska way back. Sounded like a windstorm chewing iron." Violet glanced over her shoulder. "You ever think about leaving this place for good?" He didn't answer right away. He moved toward the fire and crouched beside it, testing the warmth with one hand. "I used to," he said, "when it got too quiet or the winters too long. But not now." She ladled stew into tin bowls and set them out. "What changed?" "I stopped wanting to be anywhere else." The children ate without speaking. Outside, the snow deepened, pressing silence against the windows. The wind didn't rise, just whispered along the eaves like it meant to stay polite. After supper, Violet sat with Maybelle beside the hearth, showing her how to mend a tear in her wool stocking. Vaughn took Micah out to the barn, lantern in hand. The boy walked solemn beside him, hands tucked into the sleeves of his coat. They paused at the stall, where the old mare shifted her weight and huffed into the cold air. "Does she get cold out here?" Micah asked. "Not with all that fur and straw under her. This barn's seen worse winters than you." Micah nodded. "I think I want to be like you when I grow up." Vaughn looked down at him. "How's that?" "You know how to make people safe." Vaughn didn't speak. He just placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and let it rest there until Micah leaned into his side. When they came back inside, Violet was darning a second pair of socks, her needle moving quick and sure. She looked up as they entered. "The chimney's smoking slow," she said. "You think it's blocked?" "I'll go up tomorrow," Vaughn said. "If it's packed, I'll clear it." Maybelle stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm to the glass. "There's someone coming," she said. Vaughn moved fast, lifting the rifle from behind the door and stepping out onto the porch. The snow was thin enough to see her tracks and the stranger's, a single figure, stumbling a little, coat dragging like it didn't quite fit. "No horse." Violet stood behind him, coat thrown over her shoulders. "Not Danner," Vaughn said. "Too small." The figure came closer, one arm wrapped tight around themselves. It was a woman, face pale and drawn, hair tangled with ice. When she reached the bottom of the porch steps, she swayed once. "Is this Vaughn Astor's place?" she asked. "I'm Vaughn," he said, stepping down. "You hurt?" She nodded once, lips cracked. "Tried to get to town. Lost the trail after the bluff. Horse broke its leg. I walked." Violet moved forward, already wrapping an arm around her. "Come inside. We've got heat and broth." The girl didn't argue. Inside, she sat near the fire while Violet eased off her boots and wrapped her feet in dry cloth. Vaughn poured water, and Micah brought an extra blanket without being told. Maybelle watched from the corner, quiet. The girl's name was Liddy. She was 17, maybe 18. Her brother had gone west 2 weeks ago with a cattle drive, and she tried to follow after he didn't send word. "I thought I could make it," she said, voice hoarse. "Didn't know the land would turn on me." "It doesn't turn," Vaughn said. "Just doesn't bend to guessing." She looked up at him. "You're the one who sent word to the post in Casper last spring? About the water rights being stolen from the Crow land?" Vaughn didn't answer right away. Violet looked at him. "You never told me," she said. He nodded once. "Didn't see the need. Just did what was right. Liddy exhaled slow. My cousin's from there. He said whoever sent that letter saved them a war. Men like Danner don't stop, Vaughn said. Not unless someone forces them to. Violet looked at him and something passed between them. Not surprise, but understanding. Later, after Liddy had fallen asleep near the hearth, Violet lit a lantern and stepped out onto the porch. Vaughn followed, pulling the door shut behind them. You've done more than I knew, she said. I'm not proud of it. Just tried to keep things right where I could. She turned to face him. You ever think you should have had a different life? He shook his head. I never wanted more than what I've got now. She leaned into him. Then let's make it last. He wrapped his arms around her, the cold settling behind them but never between. I'll build you a second room come spring, he said, with a window facing east. So you can wake to the light. She rested her head against his chest. I don't need more than what I have. You will. You deserve it. Inside, the fire flickered low. The dogs slept near the hearth, Liddy breathing even now. The children had curled beneath the quilts Vaughn's mother once stitched, and the snow, steady and soft, kept falling, burying the old tracks for good. By late January, the snow had deepened enough to swallow the fence rails along the north pasture. The trees stood stripped and silent, their limbs heavy with frost. Inside the cabin, the cold no longer crept beneath the door. Vaughn had sealed the threshold with new oak. He'd milled himself from fallen trunks near the creek. The work had taken him 3 days, and he hadn't said a word about it when it was done. He didn't need to. Violet had seen him limping the next morning and pressed a hot cloth to his knee without asking. Liddy had stayed on, though her strength returned within the first week. She took to helping Violet with the washing, and the two of them had begun to speak in low, companionable tones over the workbench, their hands red from the lye soap and melted snow. Liddy didn't say much about the cousin out west or the brother who hadn't written, but she carried herself straighter now and had taken to wearing her coat with the buttons fastened properly. You think she'll stay through spring? Vaughn asked one evening as he stripped off his gloves, his hands raw from splitting wood. Violet folded a length of muslin over the back of a chair. If she leaves, it'll be because she's ready, not because she's running. You gave her that. She looked up. No, she earned that herself. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing dry snow in ribbons across the windows. Micah had fallen asleep beside the hearth, his head resting on the dog's side, while Maybelle sat with a slate and chalk, copying letters she'd seen once in a shop window in Cheyenne. She'd asked for a primer, and Vaughn had promised to ride into town come thaw. You ever think about building something more permanent? Violet asked, her voice quiet. He glanced her way. More than this. A schoolhouse. Maybe a meeting hall. Something for the families who pass through, like Liddy. There'll be others. Won't there? He nodded slowly. There will. And we've got the land. And the hands. He rubbed his jaw. You thinking of teaching? I know how to read. Maybelle's learning. Micah will too. And if I can teach them, I can teach others. Vaughn didn't answer at first. Then he said I could build it. Might take a while, but I could. You always say that like it's nothing. He looked at her, eyes soft. It's not nothing. It's yours. That night, after the children had been carried to bed and Liddy had curled beneath her quilt in the loft, Violet sat across from Vaughn near the fire, her knees tucked up beneath her skirt. The silence between them was easy now, not hollow. She watched the light flicker across his face, catching in the edges of the beard he hadn't fully trimmed since the fall. There were more silver strands now. She liked them. I didn't think I'd have this, she said. You mean peace? No. I mean a life that feels like it belonged to me, not something I was just surviving. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. You made it. I just helped hold the hammer. She smiled, but it was quiet, the way a river bends around a stone. I'm glad you did. Come March, the thaw set in. Slow at first, just a trickle from the eaves and the groan of melting ice sliding from the barn roof. Then the ground softened and the fields turned the color of wet bark and the air no longer carried the bite that made breath visible. Liddy packed her things in an oilskin satchel Vaughn had stitched for her. She hugged Maybelle and tousled Micah's hair and stood at the edge of the yard with Violet for a long moment before stepping up into the wagon with a young man from the next valley over. He tipped his hat to Vaughn and promised to keep her safe on the road to Sheridan. "She'll be fine," Vaughn said as they watched the wagon vanish over the rise. "I know," Violet replied. "She's not afraid anymore." By mid-April, the foundation for the new building had been laid. Vaughn worked with a level of intention Violet had not seen in him before, marking each beam, measuring twice, cutting once. Micah brought him nails in a tin. Maybelle swept the sawdust from the porch without being asked. Everything in their days had begun to fold around the rhythm of building. One warm afternoon, Violet stood barefoot in the garden plot she'd begun to turn over with a spade, her skirts hitched to her knees. Vaughn walked up behind her, hands still dusty from the frame he'd been raising. "You're planting already?" he asked. "I want the children to have berries by June. And onions. You said the soil here holds them well." "It does." She turned toward him, the sunlight catching in her hair. "I think this place is becoming something." He studied her face. "It already is." That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet save for the shifting timbers in the walls, Violet stepped out onto the porch. Vaughn followed moments later, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders before settling beside her. "Look there," he said, pointing to a faint glow along the northern horizon. "Storms passed." Her fingers brushed his. "You remember the night they came? The ones who followed me." "I remember every second. I'm not afraid anymore." He didn't speak, just drew her hand into his, pressing his lips to her knuckles. "I want more years like this," she said. "Not just surviving them. Living them. Waking up beside you, watching the children grow into their own." "You'll have them," he said. "All of them." When she looked at him, there wasn't anything more to say. In the spring, the schoolhouse stood finished, its windows clear, its door fitted true, its boards planed smooth and stained to a deep honeyed hue. The children helped carry in benches, Maybelle arranging a stack of borrowed books on the shelf Vaughn had carved from pine. Micah traced his initials into the underside of the teacher's table with a bit of coal, his eyes bright with mischief and pride. Violet stood at the threshold, hands on her hips, watching it all unfold. Vaughn came to stand beside her, his shirt dusted with sawdust, his boots worn but sturdy beneath him. "You did this," he said. "So did you." They'd built a home, and more than that, a life with roots deep enough to weather anything. At dusk, with the windows glowing gold behind them and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the cabin, Vaughn pulled her close beneath the open sky. "I love you," he said, voice low against her hair. She wrapped her arms around him. "And I love you for all the years we're given." The wind passed through the grass, gentle now, and the stars came out one by one over Wyoming. Within the warm walls of the home they'd made, their children slept soundly and the world outside held no fear. Together, they stood on land that no longer held ghosts. Only promise.